Hello and welcome back to Thursday Thoughts. Thoughts about the visions, the prayer life, and the impact of the prophet Daniel. Last week, I hope I piqued your curiosity and inspired you to dig deeper into some of the topics that we discussed. I confess, I've personally struggled with the large amount of details that we skipped in order to conserve time, and I'm probably going to dig back into a few of those just to give clarity as we move forward. Remember last week we took a step back in terms of chronological time. When we begin the second half of Daniel, we're no longer looking at those stories of court life. Remember, we talked about that. Chapter 1, where we met Daniel and his friends, were amazed at their incredible character, their devotion to their God. Chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar had his first dream. Chapter 3, where the friends of Daniel ended up in the fiery furnace. Chapter 4, the second dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the dream that ultimately led him to be humbled until he recognized God's sovereignty. Chapter 5, when Belshazzar saw a handwriting on the wall that basically predicted his destruction and the transition of power. And then chapter 6, where the enemies of Daniel plotted and Darius was foolish enough to sign into law the decree that ended up putting him into the lion's den. And then last week, we went into chapters 7 and 8, looking at the first vision of Daniel, skipping back in time before the transition to the Medo-Persian Empire actually took place. Now, if you gave some thought to that, you now realize that Daniel had already had his first vision before he walked into that banquet hall where Belshazzar was entertaining and where the finger wrote on the wall and where the kingdom transition was predicted. It puts a new slant on things when we realize that he has already had this first divine revelation in form of vision from God. Now, if you were inspired about our discussions of Alexander the Great and you did any research at all, then you know he did indeed conquer the known world in about 13 years before he died as a young man in his early 30s. You may have learned that he first fought the Persians in 334 BC. He actually came across the Hellespont with about 35,000 troops and defeated the Persians that first time in what we know today as modern Turkey. Now, there were Greek cities in that area, and it was his agenda to free those cities, and he did exactly that. Later, when Darius III took control of the Persian army himself, he encountered Alexander again in 333 BC. He was ready to negotiate, but Alexander was ready to conquer and moved on to Egypt. He conquered Tyre and Gaza along the way, and then on his way back towards Syria in 331 BC, a huge Persian army met him, but it ended up being the end of the Persians, and he continued his spree of conquering all the way to what we know as modern India before his army, totally worn out, returned back home. Now, I did not make something clear last week. We talked a good deal about Antiochus Epiphanes. I need you to understand that the reason the Greek Empire is probably included in Daniel's prophecies, the reason it was probably in Nebuchadnezzar's statue, is not so much because of the interaction between Alexander or the destruction of Alexander when it comes to Jerusalem. Quite the contrary. Josephus, the Jewish historian, records the conquests of Alexander, his movements, and the progressive path that he took. But he also records a story about Alexander as he was moving toward Jerusalem, no doubt with the intention to conquer. But he had a dream. While he's having a dream, God's also working in the mind and heart of the high priest in Jerusalem. His name was Jaddua. And he was very alarmed. He called the people to fast and pray. He told them to put on their very best clothes, to decorate the city, and to prepare to welcome Alexander. Now, Alexander's dream was of a man in very elaborate garb, priestly robes, who is telling him to come on across, that he's going to totally be able to conquer the Persians. And so when Alexander walks into Jerusalem, sees the people in their best, sees the city all decked out, and gets one glimpse of this high priest, he recognized that that high priest was literally the man he had seen in his dreams. He actually paid honor to the high priest. His generals were very offended. It appeared he was worshiping the man. He assured them he was not worshiping the man. He was worshiping the man the God served. But he walked out of Jerusalem, leaving it unscathed. Now hear me, that's an incredible thing. So if that's the truth, the devastation of the Grecian Empire in terms of Jerusalem and Judah doesn't happen until Antiochus Epiphanes comes onto the scene. Now, we talked about the fact that chapter 7 is a vision that's more of an overview. Babylon's not mentioned much, but it's least included. The Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and Rome are all there. When you get into chapter 8 and the focus zooms in more on the pending future that would impact the Jews, Babylon is hardly mentioned, and specific recordings about Rome are really not there either. The focus is on Medo-Persia and Greece, and then it shifts to the language about this person who is going to be so deceitful and who's going to be demonically empowered and who's going to have the agenda of destroying the religious practices, the sacrifices of the Jews. In fact, if you study, Antiochus really wanted to insert the Greek culture across the world if he had the power to do that. And he wanted to replace religions with the Greek religion and the gods that they worshiped. But he had a particular vendetta against the Jews and the God that they worship. So that's another reason to at least acknowledge that those verses at the end of chapter 8, though they may not totally focus on him, he's at least an element and plays a role there in that discussion because of the impact that he had on the Jews. Now, if you studied Antiochus Epiphanes, remember it's technically Antiochus IV Epiphanes, then you know that he's a Hellenistic king over the Seleucid Empire. That's Syria. He was actually born in about 216 BC. His birth name was Mithridate. He changed that. The minute his father died and he assumed the throne, he took Antiochus as well, but he added Epiphanes himself. And remember, it means God manifest. Hear me. It's no wonder this man is a type of the Antichrist. He literally presented himself as God manifest on earth. The gall and the audacity of that can only be matched by the Antichrist as time winds down and as the tribulation unfolds. Now, his stance against God, his persecution of God's people, all foreshadow what the Antichrist will do. Remember, I laughingly told you last week that he was sometimes not so flatteringly called Antiochus Epimanes instead of Epiphanes because it means the mad. He was, I believe, demonically empowered. I believe that the kind of things that he did could only have been the byproduct of the prodding of Satan as he takes over a life who is willing to allow him to do that. He ultimately died in about 164 BC in what we know today as modern-day Iran. Now, according to Jewish tradition, Antiochus made promises, but he was a liar. And so his agenda quickly became clear that he wanted to destroy and remove all of the traditional sacrifices, all of the traditional feasts, the way that God had told the Jews to honor him. And so in about 168 or 167 BC, he set up an image. Some say of the Greek god Zeus, others claim it was Jupiter. It's really not a deal. He put an idol into the temple. He desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. I told you that last week. And so his total agenda was just to be disrespectful of and disruptive of God and his worship by his people. Now, I read in that chapter last week that 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices were not offered because of Antiochus and his edicts and what he did to desecrate the temple. That's basically a morning and an evening sacrifice for 1,150 days, which is about 3 years, 2 months. Now, most of you know that to plan their holy days, the Jews use a lunisolar calendar, not the calendar we use, and the length of the months and the year are not exactly like ours. We're going to talk today about the prophetic calendar and about the amount of time that we think would be accurate to figure those times and seasons, and I hope that that will be of help to you. Now, it's reasonable to say, end of chapter 8, Antiochus, Antichrist. Antiochus was like the dress rehearsal for the real thing that's coming. And when you discuss the characteristics of one, you're basically discussing the characteristics of both. I talked a little bit about Judah Maccabees or Judas Maccabeus, depending on which languages and translations that you're looking at. He's actually called the hammer because Maccabees is associated with the Aramaic word for hammer. He literally drove out the invaders, led to the purification of the temple, and is still very much revered by the Jews today. I told you last week Antiochus did not die of what we would expect. He wasn't killed in battle. No underling poisoned him, and you could argue that God took him. Now, he died. I figure we know his eternal destination without being too much of a judge, but we're clearly told in chapter 7, beginning in verse 9, what's going to happen to the Antichrist. The Ancient of Days, the judge of all the earth, is going to be seated on a throne, and we are told that after the thrones of this earth are put down, God himself is going to be the judge who will ultimately order that the Antichrist will be cast into the lake of fire. I do want to clarify some more information about that scene of God on his throne that we talked about last week. I hated so much not taking time to tell you. Now, that description is probably not the Great White Throne Judgment. That description very likely is the judgment of the nations. Now, the Great White Throne is described in Revelation chapter 20. But if we go to the book of Matthew and we read information there in Matthew 25 verses 31 through 46, we get the description of what was probably happening when Daniel saw this imagery in chapter 7. And you remember the Son of Man came from heaven. He had clouds of glory. He is presented to God the Father. He is given a kingdom with dominion, a kingdom that will be an eternal kingdom. And then we see this description, if we go to Matthew, that the nations are going to stand before God and going to stand before that throne, and Jesus is going to have power and authority, and there's going to be a division of sheep nations and goat nations. with the goats on the left and the sheep on the right. It's clear if you read that entire passage, though some people are going to survive the tribulation, some of them tribulation saints, some of them wicked people who just slid under the wire. But when it comes time to decide who's entitled to the blessings of the millennium, the goats are not going to qualify. Now, it's interesting that kindness, blessing on others seems to be the criteria that is used for judgment in that passage. But I want to remind you, what's on the inside, if it's righteousness, it will come out and it will reflect and display itself as kindness and love and generosity. That's a good reminder for us today. Now, no surprise that with the magnitude of what Daniel saw, with the amount of the glory of God that he experienced and he envisioned, that he was left weak and unable to handle his duties for several days. Now, I spent a few moments reviewing, but I think that's a good thing, because I think it's important for us to keep the big picture and to tie these events together, even though sometimes we've had gaps of time and there is a clear break between the first half of the book and the second half. God had a purpose in the way all of this is knit together. When we go into chapter 9, as I promised you last week that we would today, there's another shift. Now, 7 and 8 were Daniel's first two visions, with an incredible amount of prophetic detail revealed. As we go into chapter 9, literally there are a lot of people. I was going to put a number, but that's ridiculous. Many people actually feel that chapter 9 is the backbone of all of prophecy. It is that important. It puts into place time frames and details that the rest of prophecy seems to hinge on. So let me remind you that there are going to be, again, time frames established, details. So what I want to do is go to chapter 9. I'm reading from the New King James Version today, and I want to read just 2 verses, and let's get all the background and details that we need established before we move forward. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood the books of the number of years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Now, immediately we have a time frame. It's the first year of Darius. If you'll think back, chapter 5 is the demise of Belshazzar. Chapter 6 begins in about the second year of Darius's reign. So that means the vision and the activity and the events that are about to be described in this chapter took place between chapters 5 and 6 in the first half of the book. Not only that, notice that Daniel is reading. Now, reading. What is he reading? He's reading the words of Jeremiah the prophet. He's reading about the Babylonian captivity. And he's reading specific information that even includes the amount of time, the length of years that Babylonian captivity would include. And it's clear from here that he apparently has a scroll, and he's probably reading Jeremiah 25 verses 11 and 12 and chapter 29 verse 10, because there's where we find that length of time discussed in accurate detail. So what's Daniel doing? He's studying the known prophecies. He's probably in what we would call our devotions or our quiet time, and he is keeping himself fully aware of what God has been saying to his contemporaries and to other prophets. Now, it's interesting. We do not know that this is the first time he's ever read this. We have no idea how long he's known the length of time for the captivity. This could have been the first reading. It could have been the 50th reading. That information is not provided. Now let's go back and let's begin at verse 3 and let's get the bulk of Daniel's prayer. Now, before I go into this part, I need you to understand that this is one of the longest prayers recorded in Scripture and one of the most dynamic. Interestingly enough, in the Old Testament, there are several prayers recorded in chapters number 9. There's one in Ezra chapter 9, there's one in Nehemiah chapter 9, and there's one in Daniel chapter 9. We're going to see again the character of this man revealed. He is passionately interceding. He's talking about the sin of his people. He includes himself in that process, believing that none of us are exempt. None of us are innocent in the grand scheme of a sinful nature and in the condition of our world. So pay attention to what you hear and to what you see revealed about the man. Verse 3, chapter 9. Then I set my face toward the Lord God to make requests by prayer and supplications, with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. And I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession and said, O Lord, great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and mercy with those who love him and with those who keep his commandments, we have sinned and committed iniquity. We have done wickedly and rebelled, even by departing from your precepts and your judgments. Neither have we heeded your servants the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings and our princes, to our fathers and to all the people of the land. O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but to us shame of face, as it is this day to the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and all Israel, those near and those far off, and all the countries to which you have driven them, because of the unfaithfulness which they have committed against you. O Lord, to us belongs shame of face, to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, because we have sinned against you. To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God to walk in his laws, which he set before us by his servants the prophets. Yes, all Israel has transgressed your law and has departed so as not to obey your voice. Therefore, the curse and the oath written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, has been poured out on us because we have sinned against him. And he has confirmed his words, which he spoke against us and against our judges who judged us, by bringing upon us a great disaster. For under the whole heaven such has never been done as what has been done to Jerusalem. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this disaster has come upon us, yet we have not made our prayer before the Lord our God, that we might turn from our iniquities and understand your truth. Therefore the Lord has kept the disaster in mind and brought it upon us. For the Lord our God is righteous in all the works which he does, though we have not obeyed his voice. And now, O Lord our God, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand and made yourself a name as it is this day, we have sinned, we have done wickedly. O Lord, according to your righteousness, I pray, let your anger and your fury be turned away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy mountain, because of our sins and for the iniquities of our father. Jerusalem and your people are a reproach to all those around us. Now, therefore, our God, hear the prayer of your servant and his supplications, and for the Lord's sake, cause your face to shine on your sanctuary, which is desolate. O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city which is called by your name. For we do not present our supplications before you because of our righteous deeds, but because of your great mercies. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and act. Do not delay for your own sake, my God, for your city and your people are called by your name. Now, I read that. I read it quickly. It's lengthy. I don't apologize for that. I've never heard a more humble, earnest petition for forgiveness for sin. And I have to say it because it's the truth. It's hardly that Daniel qualifies for the rankest of all sinners. We've already looked at the kind of life that he has lived and continues to live. But he understands, in comparison to the righteousness of God, none of us qualify. None of us meet the standard or the criteria. Not only that, it's clear that he's understood that the time of the Babylonian captivity is coming to an end. He knows that. He's just read that from Jeremiah's writings. But he also knows that Jeremiah recorded that that the people were to pray. God expected people to intercede that the time of captivity would end. Notice the content: praying for forgiveness of sin, praying for the restoration of Jerusalem and recovery from the awful devastation that had been levied against that city where God had placed his name. So clearly, even though this chapter is going to move into a prophetic realm, it is a call to repentance. It's a call to intercession for those of us who know God and who see what prophecy is revealing. It's not time for us to shudder in fear and say, wow, look at the signs of the times. How awful. What are we going to do? It's a time for us to look at what's occurring in our world and look up, for our redemption draws nigh. And our passion should be to see those who are lost and not ready find Jesus as Savior and Lord. Now, in Jeremiah 29 verses 12 through 14, the people were told to pray for restoration. John did the same thing in Revelation 22 and 20 when he cried out, because we know that Revelation said if the days weren't shortened, there'd be nobody left. So the mantle of prayer responsibility falls to us today as well. Now, interestingly enough, Daniel listed some people. Did you hear him? Princes and kings and important folks. So he didn't say, God, just forgive the people on the streets who don't get it and aren't living right. He said from top to bottom, from leaders down to those who are priests, those who are people, forgive all. May God grant us a passion to pray that God would forgive and heal our land as well. Now, Daniel's praying. It's obviously intercessory. It has to do with the sins of the people, with the laws of the Sabbath rest that they violated for 490 years, netting them 70 years of captivity. And so while Daniel prays about 490 years of sin, he's going to have an unexpected visitor who is going to talk about 490 years of future and prophetic fulfillment that is going to happen. So it's not going to be about past failure anymore, but about future revelation. Join me again back in Daniel chapter 9, and I'm going to read beginning in verse 20. Now, while I was speaking, notice, he's still praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God, for the holy mountain of my God. Yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Hear that. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgressions, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood. And till the end of the war desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations, and shall be one who is made desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now, I've already kind of alluded to the fact there are people who believe that all of prophecy actually hinges on the content of this portion of chapter 9. So let's go back and take a very detailed look here. Now, notice Gabriel is sent with the message. Somebody a long time ago recorded Daniel's prayer in Hebrew orally and timed it and said that spoken orally, you could offer that prayer in 3 minutes. So what does that mean? It means in roughly 3 minutes of human time. Remember, God doesn't look at time like we do. In roughly 3 minutes of human time, God heard his prayer, dispatched Gabriel, and Gabriel showed up at Daniel's house in 3 minutes. That's amazing. And so you see here that Gabriel is very often used as God's messenger. Now, more often in Scripture, Gabriel brings good news. Remember, he's the one that showed up earlier in sharing with Daniel the revelation and understanding he needed. He's the one that brought the news to Mary that she was going to have the child who would be God incarnate. So we're accustomed to seeing Gabriel in that role. Now, he's called greatly beloved. That's a pretty interesting thing. Now, we're told that God loves all of us. God also looks at the heart, and I can only imagine what he saw when he looked at the heart of this man who has been so faithful. And so I hear the affirmation in that. Now, Daniel is going to receive this revelation. It's not exactly even of the traditional vision, because basically Gabriel just explains it's called a vision. We're not told when he has it, but Gabriel's here to make him understand all of it in any case. And he's told this understanding because I believe he was praying. That speaks something to us as well, that if we want to hear from God, we have to not only be talking to him, but listening to him as well. So Gabriel says, look, there are going to be 70 weeks, and they're determined for your people, Daniel. Hear me. The content that we're dealing with is about God's dealing with the Jews. Now, there are people who basically think they rejected Messiah and God's done with them, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So what we're about to talk about is not about Gentiles. I think Gentiles have an inflated sense of their importance, like Nebuchadnezzar's statue reveals, and like I've mentioned in the past. This is about the Jews and about what God is going to do where they're concerned. So for the Jews and for the holy city, 70 weeks are determined. Now, this term weeks, a week here has nothing to do with 7 days. It literally means, you might say 77s are determined. That would be more accurate. So for your people, Daniel, 77s are determined, and that's going to turn out being 490 years. We'll explain that more in just a bit. And here's what he says. You are going to understand, Daniel, and you are going to have the understanding that's needed to share that. That's the message that's coming across here. Now, a prophetic year based on several things that we can figure is probably closer to 360 days than it is to 365. There are some interesting parallels in Scripture. If you go to the book of Genesis and you read about the flood, and you hear that it was there was a duration of 150 days involved. I know it rained for 40 days, but it took a lot longer than that to get everything under control. And that is basically, if you start looking at the months that are listed in that passage, it has to be 5 months of about 30 days. Longer won't fit. If you go to the book of Revelation and you look at the discussion of 1260 days in chapter 11 verse 3, and again in chapter 12 and verse 6, and it's talking about 3.5 years, those must be closer to 360-day years as well. Whether or not you buy into that is really not so incredibly important, because it's not going to drastically change things, but I think that that's probably true. Now, here, as he begins to talk, he has a list of things that he says is going to occur. Remember, he said there would be a finish to transgressions, an end to sins, reconciliation for iniquity, everlasting righteousness brought in, seal up the vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy. Did you catch that list? That's clearly what it is. 3 of those are about things that need to go away, and 3 of those are about things that need to be affirmed and happen. Notice what he said. Finish the transgression. So sin is no longer going to be rampant. Now, for us, victory over sin came at the cross. Thank God for what Jesus did on the cross for us. But for the Jews, not every Jew, let me be clear. For most Hebrews, they rejected Jesus. They did not see Messiah the first time as coming to deliver them. And so because of that, a redeeming work for them is a different process. And according to God's agenda, this 70 weeks is designed to bring that process about. If you're interested in that, Zechariah 12:10 and also 13:1 will give you more information. Now, to bring an end to sin, so to eliminate the principle and practice of sin, so that the remnant of Israel would come to God and accept Jesus as Messiah, to make reconciliation for iniquity because of what Messiah has done that they will then recognize, and then to bring righteousness because God, in his infinite wisdom, who willingly sent his son, Messiah not only earned the right to forgive individual sin, but to ultimately and eventually put Israel back into right relationship with God, which is amazing. Now, when it says that the vision and prophecy will be sealed up, that's basically a reference to the fact that one day all prophecies will be fulfilled. Until that time, there are many things that people probably will not exactly understand. We get it. God's ways are higher than ours. Also, there was a reference to anointing the most holy. Now, if you're a student of the Old Testament, you know that the most holy, or the holy of holies, is more often than not a reference to that part of the temple where nobody but the high priest could go, and only at designated times. So obviously, religious practices will be restored for the Jews, but the ultimate end is not a religious ritual, but an acceptance of Messiah, of Jesus Christ for who he is and for what he came to do. Now, Daniel is being shown that all of these refining judgments that God has poured out on Israel, all of those are eventually going to come to an end, and they will accept Messiah and receive righteousness that doesn't come from rituals that a man will do, but from what our Savior has done. Now, beginning in verse 25, we're given time frame information. There is a starting point and a stopping point for this prophetic revelation, this vision, this interpretation that Daniel has received. So what is the beginning point and the stopping point? Now, there's a reference to a decree to restore and build Jerusalem. If you look at history, there were actually 4 decrees that impacted to some degree the restoration and the rebuilding process. But I want you to pay attention to the wording. It said to restore and build Jerusalem. It didn't say just the temple. It didn't say just the wall. It seems to be a kind of an overarching reference. Now, the first of the decrees was by Cyrus in 538 BC, and he said, you can go build your temple. Darius issued a second decree in 517 BC, and it's like related to the temple as well. The third decree was from Artaxerxes in 458 BC, and some people argue that this is where it starts, and they have time all juggled, and they can correspond that and tie it to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. I don't believe that's right. The decree that makes real sense for us is the one that we find in Nehemiah chapter 1. And I think it's amazing that Scripture records it and records it in such detail. Again, in Nehemiah 2, verses 1 through 8. And it's in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. So that would put it at about 445 BC in the month of Nisan. And it would be, according to Jewish custom, we would understand that to mean the first day of Nisan. So if you compare that with a calendar that we would understand, that would put it at, I guess it would probably be March the 14th, 445 BC, springtime. And the day to command and restore that we find here in verse 25, I believe, corresponds with the command given in Nehemiah 1 and 2. Now, if that's true, if there's a designated time to begin, then what do we understand as the designated time to complete? What does it mean when it talks about Messiah the Prince, the anointed one, the ruler? What association should we make? And what do we understand? If we're looking for an event in the life of Jesus, an event that also corresponds with the time frames described, it's just logical that we would pick out the triumphal entry of Jesus Christ, that we would remember the words of Zechariah 9:9 that were touted that day, because he was indeed the one who was coming, the blessed one that was coming in the name of the Lord. Now, does the prophecy, the time frame, and this concept of 77s fit with the beginning point and the end point that we believe works? Let's look at that. Now, if you understand these 77s to be weeks of years, then you see some divisions here. Do you notice what he said? That there are going to be 62 weeks before Messiah is cut off, and there are going to be these 7 weeks that happen before then, and there will be 7 weeks who happen after then. Let's see if we can figure that out. If you look here in Ezra 9 and 10, Nehemiah 4, 6, 9, and 10, the completion of the temple and the period of time that it took to rebuild Jerusalem is obviously the reference in the first category of 7 weeks or 49 years. So let's look. If you have 69 weeks and then a gap, and another week. And you have seven years per week, and then you have 360 days per year. That's, it's multiplied out, but I'm going to read it. 173,880 days. So from the March date of the triumphal entry of Jesus to the end of 173,880 days, that would put us at April the 6th, 32 AD, which we really believe is the day the triumphal entry took place. Now, you can do whatever you want to do with that. And if you got lost with me in that math, if you'll email me here at the church, I'll send you an explanation of that. I believe that from Nehemiah's recordings in chapters 1 and 2, where the restoration of Jerusalem was the decree, was the permission, in fact, until the triumphal entry, you have the time frame that is described here in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25 for us, and then going into verse 26, the transition. So what do we have? 7 weeks of years, or 49 years, ending in 396 BC, when it was a time to rebuild the city. 62 weeks of years, or 434 years, the time between the decree to rebuild Jerusalem and the triumphal entry of Jesus. Now, did you notice in verse 26 it says the Messiah is going to be cut off? Because Messiah was cut off when he was crucified. When the Jews rejected him, as John recorded in John 1:11, then that created a kind of, let's say, a pause. So you have 49 years to rebuild the city, and that's the equivalent of 7 weeks, 7 times 7. You have 434 years between the rebuilding of the city and the time that Jesus made his triumphal entry, and that's 62 weeks or 434 years, and then you have him crucified, willingly sacrificing his life so that we could be restored to relationship with the Father. After Messiah is cut off, there's a gap. It's what we call unreckoned time. This verse does not talk about it. Now, why on earth would there be a gap, and why does it make sense? I need to remind you, this chapter is about God's dealings with whom? It's about God's dealings with his people, the Jews. What era are we in? What time frame are we dealing with? This is the age of the Gentiles. This is the time of grace when Gentiles who are hearing the gospel message need to respond, because this is our day of grace. So it's not shocking that there's a gap while there's this time frame for us who are Gentiles to accept Jesus, to be in right relationship with God. God will next deal with the Jews as a nation beginning during the tribulation, and it's only reckoned time when we find God dealing with the Jews as a whole. So this gap makes sense. Not only that, there are other places in Scripture where time frames seem to mean nothing, and even sequential order or chronological order doesn't seem to be that relevant. I remind you of Isaiah 9 and 6, which tells us in the same verse that a child is born, and then it says that the government's going to be on his shoulders. And we know that when Jesus came as a baby, the government was not on his shoulders. In fact, the government was not on his shoulders when Messiah was cut off, when he was crucified. The government will be on his shoulders during the millennial reign of Christ. So gaps and combining issues or combining prophecies that are not exactly in close proximity in time, that's not that unusual. Remember, with God, A year is nothing. It doesn't look the same to him. One day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like one day. Now, we know that there was a prediction that Jerusalem would be overrun again. That happened again in AD 70, and the temple was destroyed. We know that. That was the work of the Romans. 4 decades after Jesus was crucified, almost. Not so much, I think, the consideration here, but does fit into the prophetic scheme. Now, verses 26 and 27 mention 2 princes that are to come: the Messiah, and also the man of sin, the little horn, the king with the fierce countenance, the Antichrist. Call him whatever you want to call him. There are clearly 2 different leaders with 2 totally different agendas. One, our Savior, and one who has the destruction of the world in mind and the destruction of spiritual relationships with God, if he's able to do that. Now, notice it says that he's going to make a covenant in verse 27 at the beginning there. That he's going to make a covenant with the Jews at the beginning of the 70th week. Now, what we know is the tribulation. The first 3.5 years, bad, but not as bad as it's going to get. The second 3.5 years, the time when the Antichrist is going to step up and the things that are going to happen are going to be literally unthinkable. So that 7-year period is the equivalent of the last week of this prophecy. It is still future. We are still living in the unreckoned time of that gap. Today, I would encourage anyone listening to me, if Jesus is not your Savior and Lord, if you are not right with him and ready, then I encourage you to get ready, because that last week is coming, and we cannot imagine the horrors that will take place there. There will be a covenant that's supposed to grant protection to the Jews from their enemies, and also assure them that they can conduct their normal religious acts, their normal religious ceremonies. They'll go back to sacrifices in the temple, but we know that those promises are a lie. Though the first 3.5 years will be relatively peaceful, if you've been listening to Pastor Bell's teachings, you have a good understanding of these things. The last half of the tribulation is going to be terrible. It's going to be called, for lack of any other term that's even adequate, the Great Tribulation. Jesus predicted that himself. When the Antichrist breaks his covenant with the Jews in the middle of the tribulation, he's going to take away the right to offer those blood sacrifices and defame all that is holy. That phrase, the abomination of desolation, is one that we know well and have heard. Jesus warned in Matthew 24, verses 15 to 22, that it was coming. The Antichrist is not going to put a statue of Zeus or Jupiter, but he's going to erect a statue or an image of himself and demand that he be worshipped. Remember what I told you about Antiochus? He basically claimed he was God incarnate, and I told you it was just a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist was going to do, and here it is. Now, if Jesus did not shorten the days by coming back to judge the Antichrist and his armies, if the Battle of Armageddon didn't take place and the rebellion against God weren't stopped, as I said a few moments ago, there would basically be nothing left. Now, this vision does not tell us what's going to happen after the 70th week, but we know, because we have the full canon of Scripture. Christ is going to establish his kingdom on earth. There will be a 1,000-year millennial reign. God is going to reestablish his relationship with his chosen people now that they've been chastened and purified. The righteous are going to rule with Christ for 1,000 years. and there will be a glorious temple built, and worship will be offered to the Lamb who was slain to take away the sin of the world. Now, by this point, Daniel has been a captive himself for about 69 years. Don't you think that's significant and interesting? As he reads about the first 69 weeks, as we read about the first 69 weeks and know that there's that yet week of 7 years left. At any point, if he believed that God had forgotten him, this chapter reminds us that he's not forgotten. The Jews are not forgotten. And though it's not as clear, I'll tack on, neither are we. So in this day of grace, I encourage you, be an intercessor. Stay before the Lord, because week number 70, the 7 years of the tribulation, is coming. We want to be ready so that when the rapture takes place, we're taken out of here. I have no interest in knowing who the Antichrist is, and that is possible because I know who the Savior is. Have a blessed and awesome week. I can't wait to be back with you next week.